Louisiana, 1839. Colonel Mathias ruled his land with an iron hand, feared by neighbors and slaves alike. But behind the locked doors of his grand house, he hid a secret his daughter, frail and broken, kept from the world like a shameful shadow. For years she lived unseen, guarded, and forgotten. Yet one night silence cracked. A slave, thought beaten and powerless, stepped across the line no one imagined could be crossed. He took advantage of the girl Mathias had hidden, and from that night forward, the colonel's house became a tomb of secrets, fear, and vengeance. Louisiana, 1839. The colonel's name traveled faster than his horses. William Mathias was spoken of in whispers, and even the neighbors who shared his table knew better than to question his word. He was a man made of war and weather, hard edges that never soft. His land stretched wide, rows of cane and cotton, heavy under the punishing sun, and every inch of it bent to his will. Yet for all the power he carried in his voice, there was one place in his house that spoke louder than him, the locked chamber at the end of the upstairs hall. Behind that door lived his daughter. Pale, delicate, and frail, the girl was hidden from the world. Mathias had ordered heavy curtains drawn across her windows, so the daylight could not wander in and expose what he kept secret. Some said she was cursed, others that she was simply born wrong. Her bones bent strangely, her legs carried her poorly, and her mind drifted like a bird trapped in a cage it didn't understand. She was too fragile for the fields, too vulnerable for marriage, too broken for the world Mathias wanted others to believe he controlled that to him. She was shame embodied. He named her, fed her, and clothed her, but he never allowed her to step beyond the threshold of her room without escort. Visitors never knew she existed. Even the slaves spoke of her only in hushed tones, sharing scraps of rumor as though passing contraband. She was the hidden one, the secret shadow of the Carter estate. But secrets fester, and the more Mathias tried to bury her existence, the more her presence seemed to haunt the house. At night, when the rest of the plantation slept, her laughter echoed faintly through the hall's laughter that did not sound quite right. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she spoke words no one understood, and sometimes she fell silent for so long that servants thought she had vanished. She lived unseen, but she was never unfelt. Among the slaves, one man listened closer than the rest. His name is lost to history, but in whispers he was described as tall, strong, his back carved with scars, his hands hardened by work. He was beaten into silence, but not into blindness. He saw everything, even when others thought he was broken. And slowly, quietly, he began to notice the patterns of the house. When the guards fell asleep, when the shutters creaked, when the colonel drank too heavily, and the watch grew thin, the colonel ruled with fear, but fear cracks. And the night it cracked in that house began when the man with scars followed the sound of laughter, the faint, broken laughter of the girl hidden upstairs. The sound of her laughter was unlike anything else in the house. It was not the bright laughter of a young woman, but thin, uneven, like glass tapping against stone. It carried through the cracks of her locked door, startling in its oddness. The slaves said she laughed at nothing, at shadows, at the air itself. Some claimed she laughed when the colonel was angry downstairs, as though she could hear his rage through the walls. The man with scars had heard that sound many times before, while sweeping halls, carrying loads, or tending fires late at night. But this night was different. The house was quieter than usual. The guards outside had drunk too deep, their boots heavy with sleep. The colonel was away on business, leaving his daughter behind in silence. And in that silence the scarred man heard the laughter, again soft, broken, calling through the hall like an invitation. He knew the door was locked. He knew the rules better than anyone. But rules mean little when chains cut your back and silence chokes your breath. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. The laughter stopped, replaced by breathing shallow, delicate, fragile. A voice followed, barely audible. A girl's voice, trembling, whispering words that made no sense. Yet it was enough. Enough to make him turn the handle, enough to test the strength of a door that had always been locked. But that night the lock had not been set. Whether by mistake, neglect, or fate, the door opened. The room inside was dim, lit only by a single candle flickering near the window. Curtains heavy with dust hung like funeral cloths, suffocating the daylight. The girl sat by the bed, her body hunched, her dress loose against her frail frame. Her hair was pale and tangled, her eyes unfocused, as though they wandered a world unseen. She looked up at him without surprise, as if she had been waiting. No one knows what passed between them in words. Perhaps none were spoken, but the silence of that night was broken in ways that could never be repaired. When dawn came, the house had changed. Nothing outward was different. The walls still stood. The fields still stretched. The sun still rose, but inside something unspeakable had taken place. The fragile girl hidden for years was no longer untouched, and the slave once thought powerless had stepped across a line one believed could be crossed. The colonel's house was no longer a fortress of secrets. It was a tomb, heavy with fear, shame, and vengeance waiting to be unleashed. The colonel returned before dawn broke. His carriage cut through the mist like a blade, wheels grinding against the stones of the drive. He was not a man who believed in sleep when suspicion gnawed at him, and that morning suspicion clawed at his chest. The air around the Carter house felt wrong, too still, too heavy. When he entered, the servants froze where they stood. None greeted him. None dared to meet his eyes. Silence was a language on that plantation, and silence spoke louder than any confession. Mathias climbed the stairs, boots hammering wood, the rhythm of judgment echoing through the hall. He reached the locked door, the door that should never open without his hand, and he saw it. The mark, a faint scratch on the latch, as if fingers had tested it. His jaw tightened. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The candle had burned down to nothing, smoke curling in the stagnant air. His daughter lay curled on the bed, eyes distant, lips moving without sound. Her dress was loose, wrinkled, her hair wild across her face. She looked at him, not with fear, not with recognition, but with the vacant expression of someone who had seen something they did not understand. The colonel's stomach turned to stone. His eyes scanned the room. Dust disturbed. Shadows shifted. And then, at the far corner, he saw the footprint, bare, heavy, not hers. His rage did not explode. It burned slow, like coal, hotter and darker with each breath. He did not shout, did not curse. He simply turned and called for his men. The slaves were dragged from their cabins before the sun fully rose. Every man was lined in the yard, heads bowed, eyes down. The colonel's voice was quiet when he spoke, which made it worse. "One of you," he said, "has touched what is mine." The words sank into the soil. The men said nothing. Fear hung heavier than the mist. The colonel walked the line slowly, his cane striking the ground with each step. He studied their faces as if looking for cracks. Some trembled. Some clenched their jaws. Some simply waited, knowing silence was their only shield. But silence could not save them. Mathias ordered whips. He ordered chains. He ordered fire lit in the yard. One by one the men were questioned with leather against skin, iron against flesh. He demanded names, confessions, truth. But truth hides deep when fear of death is lighter than the weight of betrayal. His daughter, locked again in her room, whispered nonsense against the walls. Yet one word began to repeat in her broken speech. A name. And when the colonel heard it, his fury found a target. The man with scars. He was dragged forward, beaten until the soil drank blood. Yet when the colonel stood over him and demanded a confession, the man did not speak. His eyes rose once, meeting the colonel's gaze, steady even through pain. Silence was his only rebellion, but it was enough to turn the colonel's rage into something monstrous, because silence, in that moment, sounded like victory. The days that followed twisted the Carter plantation into something worse than a prison. The colonel ordered the scarred man bound in chains, confined not to the cabins, but to the cellar beneath the house. Each morning the sound of lashes echoed through the floorboards, and each night silence returned, silence that was more terrifying than screams. Yet silence could not erase what had happened. His daughter's body began to change. The maids who tended her saw it first, whispering behind closed doors. Her frail frame carried a secret now, a secret no lock, no cane, no lash could undo. Life had taken root where shame had lived. When word reached the colonel, the world narrowed to a point of fury. He locked himself in his study, drinking until the candles melted, until the papers on his desk blurred. His reputation, his name, his power, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. A daughter with child, not by marriage, not by choice, but by defiance. The community would know. Rumors traveled faster than truth. And when neighbors whispered, they would not whisper about crops or debts. They would whisper about him. Colonel Mathias, the man who could command armies, could not command his own house. He decided the child could not live, but fate, or cruelty, or both had other plans. His daughter clung to the life inside her with a desperation that bewildered even the maids. Though her mind wandered, though her body was weak, she held to it with the innocence of someone who did not understand sin. She whispered to her belly, sang broken lullabies, smiled at shadows, and in her simplicity she defied her father's will. The scarred man remained in chains, beaten, starved, broken in body, but his silence never wavered. The colonel offered him release if he would admit, if he would beg, if he would confess to shame. But the man never spoke. He endured, and that endurance ate at Mathias more than screams ever could, because endurance is another kind of rebellion. By winter's edge, the plantation was hollowed. The slaves worked in fear. The house groaned with secrets, and the colonel himself was a shell of fury walking on unsteady legs. His daughter's belly grew. The whispers grew louder, and the soil of Louisiana held a story no one dared to write. But everyone knew when the child was born, The colonel did not look at it. He turned away, his cane striking the floor like a verdict. He saw only shadows, only shame, and the house became what history remembers it as, a tomb of secrets, fear, and vengeance. The birth did not silence the house. It filled it with new voices' soft cries in the night, muffled whispers in the hallways, and the ever-present gnawing of rumor. The infant was small, fragile like its mother, yet alive. Against the odds, against the colonel's fury, it drew breath. The slaves whispered about the child. Some said it was a curse, others said it was a sign. But no one dared speak too loudly, because the colonel's rage had not subsided, it had grown. He refused to look at the baby, refused to acknowledge it as blood or kin. To him it was a wound made flesh, a reminder that he had been defied in his own house. He ordered the child kept from sight. No neighbors would see it. No priest would bless it. No name would be given. He wanted it erased. But erasing is not the same as forgetting. The cries seeped through the floorboards, a constant reminder that his power had limits. Meanwhile, the scarred man remained in the cellar, shackled in darkness. His body wasted, but his silence endured. Every lash, every hunger, every torment failed to break him. And the colonel began to sense something he could not admit, that the slave's silence was stronger than his fury. One night, in his drunken haze, Mathias descended to the cellar with a lantern. He stood over the broken man, eyes burning. "Do you think you've won?" he hissed. "You think silence makes you free? Look what you've left behind: shame, filth, a child that should never have been." The man did not move, did not speak. His eyes, dim in the lantern light, held the colonel as if he were the one bound in chains. And for the first time, Mathias felt something foreign crawl through him. Not guilt, not mercy, but fear, because silence is louder than screams when it refuses to die. Days passed, then weeks. The girl, fragile as she was, clung to her child. She rocked it, sang broken lullabies, smiled at shadows as if they were friends. And the house bent under the weight of her strange joy, but the colonel could not allow joy. He ordered the child taken. The maids begged, the slaves trembled, even the overseer hesitated. But Mathias's command was iron. The baby was carried from the room, its cries echoing down the hall until the sound faded into silence. The mother wailed, her fragile body thrashing, her voice echoing like a curse. She screamed until her throat broke. The house quivered with the sound, walls rattling as if the wood itself mourned. Mathias told himself it was necessary, that by removing the child he was erasing the stain on his name. But even he could not erase what the house had become, a place where secrets lived louder than truth. The slaves began to talk at night, low and dangerous. They whispered of rebellion, of fire, of vengeance. The scarred man's silence became their rallying cry. And though Mathias chained him, beat him, starved him, the man endured. His survival became a story, and stories are more dangerous than swords. The colonel sensed it. He felt the weight of eyes on him, the weight of whispers in the dark. His cane struck harder, his commands sharper, but authority is a thread that frays when pulled too tight. And in the silence after the child's disappearance, the thread began to snap. The baby did not vanish as the colonel hoped. It lived hidden, hushed, passed between hands in the dark. Some maids fed it, some slaves guarded it, all in secret. What Mathias tried to bury, the house itself seemed determined to keep alive. At night, faint cries carried through the halls. Mathias drank more, cursed louder, struck harder. He forbade mention of the child, yet the silence surrounding it only grew louder. Silence has weight, and soon it crushed even him. His daughter grew weaker without the baby. She withered, staring at walls as if they had taken her voice. Sometimes she whispered the child's name, though no one knew how she had chosen it, or if it was even real. To her it was alive in every corner of the house, and in that way she defied her father still. The scarred man endured. Every punishment failed to break him. Every attempt to silence him only deepened his defiance. The slaves watched and learned. They saw that the colonel's power was not absolute, that silence could outlast cruelty. And they began to believe. Whispers became plans. Plans became promises. The Carter estate was no longer bound only by chains. It was bound by stories. Stories of the girl hidden, of the child stolen, of the man who refused to bow. One night the bell that had long remained silent rang. Not by the overseer's hand, not by the colonel's order, but by the slaves themselves. The sound tore through the night like thunder, waking the house, shaking the land. Mathias stumbled from his bed, pistol in hand, rage in his eyes. But when he stepped into the yard, he saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the torchlight, not cowering, not kneeling, silent, watching. The scarred man, freed by hands braver than chains, stood among them. His body broken, but his silence whole. He stared at the colonel, not with hate, but with something worse, indifference. As if the man who had ruled them with iron was no longer worth the weight of fury. Mathias raised his pistol. His hands shook, and in that moment he realized the truth. Power is not in the cane, the whip, or the gun. Power is in what people choose to obey. And no one obeyed him anymore. The bell tolled again. The house behind him groaned as if it, too, had abandoned him, and the colonel understood. The tomb he built was not for them. It was for him. The bell's echo clung to the night like smoke. It rolled across the fields, through the swamp, into the very bones of the Carter estate. Never before had it rung without the colonel's command. Never before had it called people to gather for something other than his word. Now it tolled with defiance. Colonel Mathias stood alone in the yard, pistol shaking in his hand. He had faced war, blood, and rebellion before, but never silence turned against him. The slaves did not shout, did not riot, did not beg. They simply stood, dozens of them, lit by torches, eyes steady and unblinking. The scarred man stood at their front. Chains had been broken from his wrists, the irons still dangling like trophies. His body was bent by torment, but his presence was taller than the colonel had ever seen. He said nothing. He only stared, and in that stare Mathias saw his own reflection. Hollow, furious, afraid. For a long moment nothing moved. The fire crackled, the bell groaned, and the colonel's heart beat louder than either. He wanted to shout, to curse, to command, but his words died before they reached his lips. Because words are power only when others choose to obey them. Finally, Mathias spoke. "Back to your cabins," he said, his voice brittle, cracking against the silence. No one moved. Now. His shout cut through the air, but it was empty. A sound without weight. The scarred man raised his hands, still bound by fragments of chain. Slowly, deliberately, he let them fall to the ground. The clatter rang louder than the colonel's pistol. A symbol, a statement, a verdict. The slaves began to move not toward the cabins, but forward. A step, then another. Not rushing, not rioting, simply advancing with the steady rhythm of inevitability. Torches swayed, shadows stretched, and the colonel stepped back. For the first time in years he retreated. He fired his pistol. The shot split the night, echoing through the fields. But no one fell. The bullet struck dirt, useless, forgotten the moment it left the barrel. The crowd did not flinch. The scarred man did not blink. The pistol clicked empty. Mathias stood with nothing left but the cane in his trembling hand. And suddenly the house behind him felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. The walls seemed to lean, the windows staring down at him, the doors whispering truths he could no longer silence. He shouted again, but the words turned to ash in his throat. The bell tolled once more, rung by hands that had been denied the rope for generations. And with each toll the colonel's world crumbled, because power is not taken by force alone. It is surrendered when fear refuses to bow. The march forward did not end in chaos. It ended in silence heavier than the colonel's own footsteps as he backed away, cane tapping nervously against the boards of the porch. He stumbled into his house, slamming the door shut, bolting it like a coward hiding from ghosts. But ghosts do not obey locks. They seep through wood, crawl under doors, whisper through cracks. Inside, Mathias paced the hall, pistol useless in his trembling hand. He barked orders at shadows, called for overseers who would never come, demanded loyalty from a house that no longer listened. The walls echoed only with the cries of his daughter upstairs, mourning her child. The sound cut deeper than whips ever could. He stormed into her room, eyes wild. She sat by the window, rocking herself, whispering lullabies to air. When he shouted her name, she turned her head slowly, smiling faintly at something only she could see. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where have they hidden it?" But she did not answer. Her eyes drifted past him, unfocused, as if he were the ghost and not the master. She laughed thin, broken laughter that pierced his rage. He struck the wall beside her, the wood splintering under his cane. She flinched, but did not cry. She kept humming, as if the world had chosen to leave him behind. The colonel staggered back into the hall, the sound of the bell still echoing in his skull. The house seemed alive now, breathing against him, pressing in from all sides. He saw shadows move where no one stood. He heard footsteps in empty rooms. He smelled smoke, though no fire burned. Downstairs the scarred man had entered, not with force, but with presence. He stepped across the threshold as though it belonged to him, and perhaps now it did. Behind him others followed, silent but unyielding. They did not shout, they did not riot, they simply walked into the heart of the house, taking the space that had denied them for years. The colonel raised his cane as if it were a sword. But no one feared it. Not any more. "Get out!" He roared, his voice breaking. "This is my house." The scarred man met his eyes and spoke for the first time. His voice was low, rough, scarred as his body. "No, it was never yours." The words crushed the last stone of Mathias's power. His knees buckled. His cane fell. The silence that followed was not submission. It was a verdict. The slaves spread through the house, not destroying, not burning, but reclaiming. They touched the walls, the furniture, the floors, as if breathing life back into what had been suffocated. The house moaned under the weight of history, shifting from fortress to grave, from grave to something new. The colonel fled to his study, the only room he believed still his. He locked the door, poured whiskey with shaking hands, and stared at the portraits of ancestors on the wall. Their painted eyes seemed to mock him, to remind him that legacy is not built by chains, but by what survives chains. And outside his door, the house kept breathing, louder, heavier, alive in ways he could no longer control. Colonel Mathias locked himself inside his study as the night thickened around him. The oak door rattled with every distant step, every whisper that bled through the walls. He poured glass after glass of whiskey, but the fire in his throat did nothing to calm the tremor in his hand. Outside the locked door, silence stretched like a noose. The portraits of his ancestors stared down at him from the walls. Men in uniforms, men who had ruled land and lives with certainty. Their painted eyes mocked him now. He muttered to them, cursed them, begged them to lend him their strength. But the silence that answered was heavier than death. Downstairs, the slaves moved through the house, not in chaos but with purpose. Their torches glowed against the faded wallpaper. Their feet creaked against the polished floors. They did not shout or riot. They simply took space. The scarred man led them, his silence still unbroken, his presence filling every room. He was no longer just a slave, he was a symbol, living proof that endurance could outlast tyranny. The colonel's daughter remained in her chamber. She sang broken lullabies, rocking herself by the window. She spoke to the empty air as though the child she had lost was still there. Some whispered she was mad. Others thought she was blessed with visions. But all agreed on one thing. Her voice pierced deeper than any blade. Mathias rose suddenly, slamming his cane against the desk. "This is my house," he bellowed, though no one heard. Or worse, no one cared. He pulled his pistol, checked it, cursed when he remembered it was empty. The emptiness mocked him. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, echoing against the oak door. Not the frantic knock of a servant, not the urgent strike of an overseer. It was steady, patient, a rhythm that said, "We are here." "You cannot hide that." Mathias gripped his cane with both hands, sweat dripping down his face. He did not answer. The knock came again, louder, then silence. The silence was worse. He sat there for hours, the house breathing around him, the walls groaning, as if the wood itself had turned against him. He thought of escape, but where would he run? The swamps? The road? Every path led through the eyes of those who now refused to bow. By dawn, the colonel had not moved. He sat slumped in his chair, cane across his knees, eyes bloodshot and wide. The knock never came again, but the silence remained, and silence is heavier than chains. The plantation no longer belonged to Mathias, though his name still clung to its gates. It belonged to whispers now, to eyes that no longer lowered, to steps that no longer faltered. The slaves moved freely within the house, cleaning rooms once forbidden, walking halls once patrolled. They touched what had been denied to them, not with destruction, but with reclamation. The scarred man became their silent center. He did not speak, but he did not need to. His very existence was enough. The chains that had scarred him clattered like broken relics wherever he walked. He passed Mathias's study more than once, but never entered. He didn't need to. The colonel had already imprisoned himself, but there was one room no one touched. The daughter's chamber. She remained at her window, rocking and whispering lullabies to the air. Her frail body bent, her pale face distant. She was both tragedy and prophecy, fragile yet untouchable. When others approached her door, they heard her voice singing to something unseen. Some said she still cradled her child in her mind. Others swore they saw shadows cradle her in return. One night, as the moon hung swollen over the fields, a sound spread through the house again. A cry, soft, weak, but living. The maids rushed, torches trembling in their hands. They followed the sound, hearts pounding. And there, hidden in a small chamber beneath the stairs, they found it. The child, frail, wrapped in torn cloth, alive despite everything. Gasps filled the air. They carried the baby carefully, whispering prayers. Some wept, some laughed in disbelief. The child had survived, and with it came something the house had not held in years. Hope. When word reached the colonel, he erupted. He stormed from his study, cane striking against the floor like a war drum. His face was red, twisted with rage. He shouted for the baby to be brought to him. The slaves did not move. The maids clutched the infant tighter, shielding it with their bodies. The scarred man stepped forward, standing between Mathias and the child. His silence was unbroken, but his message was clear. You will not take this one. The colonel's hand trembled around his cane. He wanted to strike, to kill, to destroy. But his legs weakened beneath him. His breath hitched. And in that moment, with torches burning around him, he saw the truth. The child was not a curse. The child was his end. Because legacies are not built in blood alone. They are built in what survives after power dies. And this child born in shame, raised in whispers, cradled in defiance, was proof that Mathias could not erase his own ruin. The colonel fell to his knees, not in prayer, not in mercy, but in collapse. His cane clattered across the floor. His voice broke, whispering the same word again and again. Mine, mine. But no one answered. Because the child did not belong to him. The night after the child was revealed, the Carter estate shifted from silence to judgment. For years, Colonel Mathias had been the judge, jury, and executioner of every life within his walls. But now the house itself had turned, and the people who once trembled at his cane gathered not in fear, but in resolve. The slaves stood in the yard, torches raised high, their faces grim and steady. Women with worn hands, men with scarred backs, children with eyes too old for their age, all of them gathered, as if called by something greater than defiance. The maids who had cradled the infant stood among them, their arms crossed, their gazes sharp. At the center stood the scarred man. His silence was not weakness, it was command. Without words, he had become the voice of all who had suffered in shadows. Tonight he would not speak for them. His silence was enough. The colonel was dragged from his study. He shouted, cursed, spat. He called them beasts, animals, demons. His cane swung, but it no longer carried weight. His words, once law, were now only noise. The more he shouted, the more their silence swallowed him. They placed him in the yard. beneath the bell that had rung without his command. The torches circled him, the firelight painting him small, fragile, exposed. For the first time he was the one surrounded. He demanded the overseers come. None came. He called his daughter's name. Her window was closed, curtains drawn. He screamed for the child, the infant, demanding it be given to him as proof he still had power. But when the baby's faint cry reached his ears, carried in the arms of the women, it was not brought forward. It was shielded. Protected. The people he had once owned stood now as his jury. They said nothing. They waited. They let him speak until his voice cracked, until his curses turned to whimpers, until the great Colonel Mathias trembled like a leaf in the wind. Then, slowly, the scarred man stepped forward. He looked into Mathias's eyes, broken yet burning, and lifted the fragments of chains still hanging from his wrists. He let them fall into the dirt with a sound that was louder than any verdict. The chains landed at Mathias's feet. The jury did not need words. The judgment was clear. His time was over. The days that followed were not written in ledgers or newspapers. They lived only in whispers, in memories carried by those who survived. To the outside world, the Carter estate was quiet. The fields still swayed, the house still stood, but within its walls, the colonel's empire had ended. He no longer commanded. He no longer punished. He no longer ruled. He lived, yes, but stripped of the one thing he valued most, obedience. His presence carried no weight. His cane struck wood, but no one flinched. His voice barked orders, but no one obeyed. He became a shadow of himself, a ghost haunting a house that had already moved on without him. The slaves continued their work, but on their terms. The scarred man, though broken in body, walked freely. His silence became a kind of scripture, a truth carried by all. He did not need to lead. His very survival had already led them. The colonel's daughter remained in her room, cradling her fragile child. Some said she smiled more often now, humming lullabies that seemed to echo through the house. Others swore she spoke to shadows, thanking them for protection. Whether madness or faith, her voice carried hope, and hope was more dangerous than rebellion. Visitors noticed the change. Neighbors who once saw a fortress of order now saw a house sagging with secrets. They whispered that Mathias was ill, that his mind had broken, that the plantation would not outlive him. He denied it, of course. He still dressed in his uniform, still polished his boots, still strutted through the halls. But his reflection in the mirror betrayed him eyes sunken, hands trembling, mouth whispering curses to ancestors who no longer answered. At night, the bell tolled again. Not by his hand, by theirs, always slow, deliberate, echoing across the fields. It was not a call to labor, but a reminder, a warning, a prophecy. Each toll said the same thing. Your power is gone. The colonel tried to fight it. He hired new overseers, men from distant towns, but they did not last. Some left after a week, unsettled by the silence of the slaves, by the way they watched without fear. Others vanished entirely, swallowed by swamp or rumor. The estate seemed cursed, as if the land itself had turned against him. The final blow came not from rebellion, but from emptiness. One morning Mathias awoke to silence. He stormed the halls, shouted, demanded, but the cabins were empty, the fields abandoned. The slaves had gone, melting into the swamps, into the night, into freedom. Not with fire, not with blood, but with silence. and the house groaned as if sighing with relief. The colonel wandered its halls alone, his cane clicking against wood, echoing through rooms that answered only with emptiness. His daughter still sang upstairs, the baby's cries mingling with her lullabies. But for him, the house was hollow. The portraits of his ancestors stared down with disappointment, their eyes mocking him. Still, in the end, Mathias was not killed by revolt or vengeance. He was killed by something worse, irrelevance. He lived long enough to watch his name rot, his estate crumble, his power dissolve. He became the ghost of his own legend, trapped in the tomb he had built with his own cruelty. By 1840, the Carter estate was only a whisper of what it had once been. The fields, once green and heavy with cane, grew wild and untended. The cabins stood empty, their doors swinging in the wind. No laughter, no cries, no footsteps echoed across the land, only the rustle of weeds reclaiming what had been stolen. Colonel Mathias remained, clinging to stone and wood, as if they were soldiers still loyal to him. He walked the porch at dawn, cane tapping, boots polished, uniform buttoned tight. But his audience was gone. The world he ruled had slipped through his fingers like swamp water, and no amount of rage could hold it. Visitors came rarely. Those who did left quickly, unsettled by the silence of the place, by the sight of the colonel wandering alone. They whispered in town that the house was cursed, that screams echoed from its walls at night, that the bell tolled by itself. Inside, the house decayed. Wallpaper peeled, wood rotted, dust gathered thick. The daughter remained upstairs, her lullabies now softer, slower, tinged with sorrow. The child, fragile but growing, was her only light. She clung to it with the innocence of someone who never understood the chains around her. For Mathias, the child was a wound that never healed. He avoided it, refused to look at it, cursed its existence. Yet he could not erase it. The baby's cries haunted his halls, proof of his defeat. Every time it laughed, it mocked him. Every time it cried, it condemned him. At night, the colonel drank until his vision blurred. He spoke to the portraits on his walls, demanding answers, begging for salvation. The ancestors stared down in silence. Their painted eyes seemed colder now, as though ashamed of the blood that carried their name. And sometimes, when the whiskey was low and the shadows long, he swore he saw them move. Their lips curled in scorn, their eyes narrowing, their hands reaching from the canvas to drag him into their disappointment. The slaves had taken nothing from him but obedience. Yet obedience was everything, and without it he was no more than a man frail, broken, forgotten. The bell tolled again one night, though no hand touched it. Mathias stumbled into the yard, pistol in one hand, cane in the other. The sound cut through the fog, deep and resonant. He looked around, but the cabins were empty, the fields deserted. Only shadows moved, bending in torchlight that no one carried. And for the first time, Mathias wondered if the house itself had turned against him. Time is cruel, and it does not honor legacies built on fear. Colonel Mathias lived long enough to see his name rot, his estate crumble, and his power mocked in whispers. By 1842, no one spoke of him with respect. They spoke of him with pity, with fear, with disgust. The daughter, frail yet stubborn, outlived his power. Her child grew, a living mark of defiance, proof that no chain is stronger than survival. She sang lullabies that drifted through cracked windows, carrying across the fields like hymns of resistance. Some swore her voice kept the house alive. Others swore it cursed it. Mathias died in that house, not by rebellion, not by fire, but by irrelevance. They found him slumped in his study, cane across his knees, eyes open, and staring at portraits that no longer cared to watch him. His body was buried in the family plot, but his grave grew wild, weeds curling over his name until it disappeared. The house did not die with him. It lingered. Neighbors avoided it, calling it haunted. Travelers swore they heard the bell toll when no one lived there. Some claimed they saw a frail woman in the upstairs window, holding a child that should have been long grown. Others heard chains clatter in the cellar, silence screaming louder than voices. The legend grew, not of the colonel, not of his battles or his wealth, but of the secret he tried to bury. The story of the hidden daughter, the scarred man, the child born in shadows. A story of silence louder than screams, of vengeance without fire, of a house that became a tomb. And so history remembers not the power of Colonel Mathias, but the ruin of it. His name is dust, his estate is ash. But the story endures, because some houses do not collapse into the earth. They collapse into memory, and memory is the only grave that never closes.